Hi there. In this episode, a top 11 list, bargain and interesting hardware samplers. Hardware samplers had their day, starting in the late 70s and fizzling out in the early 2000s. The mid-80s through the early 2000s was probably the peak of sample nirvana. Some folks still love hardware samplers despite the prevalence of Kontakt and other software sampler plugins. Like I always do, I'll give you the list with the pictures and some of the specs and features as I go. I chose the samplers on this list based on a bunch of objective and subjective criteria that includes price, sound quality, build quality, ease of use, expandability, synth lore, though in this case sampler lore, and a bunch of other factors. In this list you'll find some heavy hitter bargain hardware samplers. By this I mean hardware that truly delivers outstanding performance for each dollar spent. In the list I'll also include samplers that are rare, beloved, and simply conversational. Think of this list as a list, not the list. And I tried to keep this list to samplers below the $1,000 price point. I've owned some of these samplers and I've played them all. If your favorite sampler didn't make it onto this list, it will probably make it onto another list. This list includes both sampler keyboards and rack units. There are 7 different manufacturers represented in this list. Let's do this. Number 11, Ensoniq Mirage. Came out in 1984. As I said in another episode, there was probably little doubt in manufacturers' minds that sampling was going to be a thing. Manufacturers just needed the state-of-the-art of technology to catch up to make it affordable to everyday musicians. Memory was crazy expensive, and so was processing power. A year earlier, the Yamaha DX7 was released. For its time, the DX7 was a sonic milestone. I believe it was the success of the DX7 that pushed other manufacturers into sampling to combat that success. My jaw dropped when I heard the Mirage for the first time. I recall playing a piano patch on it and thinking that DX7 had a real competitor. At $1,695, it was at least as affordable as a DX7, in fact a little bit less. Probably the biggest disadvantage of samplers were the load times for patches. Press a button or two on a synth and you have new sounds. On a sampler of the 80s, you might have to wait a minute or two for sounds to load. My observations at the time were that the Mirage had a tiny display of only 2 characters, the buttons were small and cheesy, and the keyboard feel was horrible. They later fixed that. At least it was velocity sensitive. I couldn't see working musicians switching out discs and waiting. Still, it was a real sounding device at an affordable price. Obviously in the studio, load times wouldn't be such an issue. If I remember correctly from reading Keyboard magazine back in the 80s, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis used a Mirage and they produced the likes of Janet Jackson. That's a pretty decent recommendation for the Mirage. When I would read Keyboard magazine about big-time musicians back in those days, some of them had synclaviers or Fairlights, but those instruments were the price of a house. The Mirage was affordable. It has 8-voice polyphony, 128 kilobytes of sample RAM, plus another 16K for the system and sequencer. That sequencer has a capacity of 333 events. Use the bender or the mod wheel and those get eaten up very fast. Think of it more like a scratch pad. It has one Curtis CEM3328 low-pass filter chip per voice. You can vary the sample rate from 10 kHz to 33 kHz, and it's 8-bit sampling. Still, that was pretty good for this time period. Depending on the sample rate selected, you might have as little as 4 seconds or as much as 13 seconds of total sample time. Samples are saved on 720K 3.5-inch floppy disks. So one of these guys, as opposed to one of these, which is a 5.25-inch disc. There are a few variants of the Mirage to talk about. The first units from 1984 were all metal construction, and they had that crappy key bed. The keys were very light to the touch. The 1985 Mirage DSK-8 had a better key bed with polyphonic aftertouch and had a heavier feeling keyboard. The 1987 Mirage DSK-1 contained more plastic and added one set of stereo outputs, but lost the expansion port, so you couldn't add the sampling filter / memory expansion. On the back panel, you'll find a standard IEC power cable, a power switch, a fuse, a foot switch input, an expansion port, MIDI in and out on standard 5-pin DIN connectors, there's no through, a mono audio input for sampling, and either a mono output or a set of stereo output jacks, depending on which version you have. Just like some other samplers from this time period, there are replacement drives that allow you to load samples from a thumb drive. With the different variants of the Mirage, the floppy drive was originally on the far left under the end of the keyboard. On the newer version, it's on the front panel above the pitch and mod wheels. I remember reading that it's not possible to add the thumb drive option to the older version because there isn't enough room. You should definitely do some research before you invest your money if you would like to incorporate the thumb drive option. A Mirage keyboard or rack unit in good working condition sells in the range of $500 to $750. On Reverb and eBay, you'll often find a few Mirages in non-working condition for around $300. Personally, I wouldn't risk it unless you're a super tech. Based on the state of the art that Mirages are only 8-bit, prices are not good. You can buy hardware samplers with much better specs for a lot less money. The thing is, the Mirage was an early trendsetter, and people love it because of that. Just like a lot of gear from this time period, the 80s, it commands a higher price. You can think of it as sampler lore instead of synth lore, like I already said previously. But also there was a creative spark of genius that many musicians and producers found with the Mirage and the newly affordable technology of sampling. It was essentially bending technology to your music will. Number 10, Korg DSS-1, 1986. When it comes to Korg samplers, there aren't a lot to choose from. Not compared to Akai, Roland, and Yamaha. The DSS-1 and its rack mount version are the only Korg samplers from the 80s. I believe this is probably because Korg went another route, and that route was Rompler with the M1. But this episode is about samplers. The DSS-1 specs look pretty good for 1986. You get a 5-octave velocity and aftertouch sensitive keyboard. Sampling is 12-bit at either 16, 24, 32, or 48 kilohertz sampling. Memory starts at 256 kilobytes. You get a stereo digital delay effect on board, which is very nice. An unusual 20-character by 2-line display. Not exactly sure why Korg did this. Maybe it was to accommodate the 6-stage envelope generator or other parameters, or just Korg being generous, because most displays at that time were 16 characters by 2 lines. The DSM-1 is the rack mount version of the DSS-1 and was released a year later in 1987. It has 1 meg of RAM instead of 256 kilobytes. It uses higher density discs, has 16 individual audio outs, a multi-timbral mode, and most of all, 16 voice polyphony instead of only 8. Its updated operating system also loads faster. It loses the digital delay effect from the DSS-1, a few other features, and most notably, the filter resonance of the keyboard unit, and a lot of people swear by that. Unlike most samplers at that time, Korg put the operating system in ROM. That was very forward-thinking. The back panel of the keyboard has a suspiciously Roland-looking 2-pronged socket detachable power cable. MIDI in, out, and through on standard 5-pin DIN connectors. You'll also find separate damper pedal and patch advance inputs, a mono audio input for sampling, and a set of left and right audio outputs, all on 1/4-inch connectors. There's also a 1/4-inch stereo headphone jack. I recall playing this unit when it first came out and thinking it sounded pretty good. Like I said, I think Korg was putting all of its efforts into the M1, and rightly so. I don't think Korg ventured into sampling again until the Triton series, and that was 13 years later. You can pick up a nice condition DSS-1 in the $300 to $400 range. I've seen some huge variability in prices with folks asking as much as $1,000 and more. I think that's unrealistic, but you can be the judge. On the other hand, it's the only Korg keyboard sampler of the 80s. You can pick up the rack mount DSM-1 for about $500. Number 9, Yamaha TX16W. I owned one of these samplers for a short time. I mentioned in another episode that the 16W has an operating system programmed by a dyslexic hamster. And that's me being polite. When I owned mine, a freeware operating system called Typhoon wasn't available, or if it was, I just wasn't aware of it. It's widely held that the Typhoon OS makes the 16W a lot easier to use. At the time, I already owned a Roland S550. The S550 used a mouse and a monitor screen. It was incredibly easy to use compared to the Yamaha. On the other hand, the Yamaha had much better specifications. It's a 2-unit rack space device. No keyboard version was made. It has 16 voice polyphony with 12-bit mono sampling at 50 kHz and stereo sampling at 33 kHz. It came with 1.5 megabytes of RAM and was expandable to 6 megabytes. The display is 40 characters by 2 lines and is backlit LED. Samples are loaded from 720K floppies. For about $100, you can buy a floppy drive replacement with a USB port. On the back panel, you get left and right outputs, 8 individual outputs, MIDI in, out, and through on standard 5-pin DIN connectors. The power cable is permanently attached, and that was kind of standard for Yamaha gear back in the 80s. The front panel looks a lot like other Yamaha devices from that time period, including the Rev 7, the Rev 5, and very much like the TX802. It is an 8-voice multi-timbral machine. It has digital filters for subtractive synthesis. It's a good sounding sampler, and I resampled some of its sounds into my Roland before I sold the Yamaha. Prices for a good condition unit range from $250 to $500, but you'll find some for way more than that. Sometimes these are units that have the retrofitted USB drive instead of the floppy drive. Other times they're just overpriced. There is a VST software emulation of the TX16W by Sonic Charge called Cyclone. You can Google this and you can download it for free. Number 8. Ensoniq EPS 16 Plus, circa 1990. Before I get too far into the EPS review or saying some things about it, I want to say that there's some conflicting information on the internet. The information I'm giving you here is from the manual. There are both keyboard and rack mount versions of this sampler. It's a 16-bit sampler with 7 different sample rates from 11.2 to 44.6 kilohertz. It has a nice fluoro display and a 3.5-inch disk drive. Power is via a standard IEC connector. The keyboard specs are as follows. 2 audio outputs with a mono audio input for sampling. You get 1 megabyte of RAM upgradable to 2 megabytes. It has a sequencer with approximately 160,000 events. You get less events when you have sounds loaded. And there are some limitations to the sequencer, but I doubt folks would really be using it as a serious sequencer. You have options to add a SCSI drive, 6 more audio outputs, and of course the memory expansion I already mentioned. Finding those expansion options is probably impossible today, so you'll want to find a used unit with them already installed. Now the rack unit. It came standard with 2 megabytes of RAM and 8 audio outputs. You can replace the floppy disk drive on both units with a USB thumb drive replacement. Each unit comes with MIDI in, out, and through on standard 5-pin DINs. Each voice has 2 filters to affect the sound. A nice feature is the onboard digital effects. 13 different effects, with most of them being multi-effects, including reverbs, delays, distortion, rotary speaker, flanger, phaser, compression, wah-wah, and of course, they are stereo. The unit has 20 voice polyphony, but when you're using higher level effects like the 44 kilohertz reverb effects, it reduces polyphony to 13 voices. Rack units in good condition sell used in the $750 to $850 range. Keyboard prices vary wildly, as low as $400 to as much as $900. There can be keybed problems with the keyboard version. You need to be aware of that. Its advantage is polyphonic aftertouch, but truthfully, how often have you used it or missed it on the other keyboards you own? You would really have to love this unit because it's expensive for what it is. There are certainly other units on this list that are less expensive and come with much better specifications. I know some people really love Ensoniq and the EPS series, so I'm not going to say any more. Number 7, Casio FZ1. In 1987, Casio released this 16-bit keyboard sampler. All the affordable samplers at that time were 12-bit, so this was a big deal. It had other respectable specs as well. It has 8 voices at 16-bit and sampling rates of 36, 18, and 9 kilohertz. RAM is 1 megabyte and the unit has a front panel mounted 3.5-inch floppy drive. A thumb drive replacement for the floppy drive is available. A 96 by 64 dot LCD graphic display is available for editing. The keyboard is 5 octaves with velocity and aftertouch. The back panel includes 8 individual audio outputs, a mix output, mic and line inputs for sampling, and 2 foot switch inputs, all on 1/4-inch jacks. One of the foot switches is for a variable pedal, and think assignable pedal. You can assign it to things like volume or LFO. There is MIDI in, out, and through on 5-pin DINs, a power switch, a standard IEC power socket. Also, you'll find 2 additional ports. One is listed as external port. The other is listed as expansion memory. The external port allows 2 FC1s to be connected together to share data. Page 126 of the manual talks a little bit about this, but there's not very much information. It looks like a DB25 connector. An MB10 RAM board, which is proprietary, expands the unit's memory to 2 megabytes total when inserted into the expansion memory slot. Wave synthesis is included. It won't replace your Jupiter 8 or any of your other synths really, but you can experiment and have some fun. The manual is 134 pages, which is quite a lot of pages for 1986. Prices for a unit in good condition range from $500 to $700. Like many samplers on this list, there are always a couple of people asking some ridiculous price, even when there are several units in the range I'm giving you. Obviously, a unit with the memory expansion should cost a little bit more. Number 6, Akai S900. This sampler was released in 1986, and I didn't feel that I could do this first list and not include the Akai S900. It was in 1986 that I moved to the Miami area for about 5 years, and many studios I visited had an S900. It was truly prolific. I would go to a new studio and there it was, staring back at me, that S900 whiteface. It's a 12-bit sampler with 8 voices and an LCD display that is 2 lines by 40 characters. Very generous for that time period. On the rear panel, you get 8 individual audio outputs, left and right mix outputs, and a mono output. You also get MIDI in, out, and through on standard 5-pin DIN connectors. The power cable is permanently attached. The back panel also has an RS-232 interface for connection to a computer. On the front panel, you have all the controls: a floppy disk drive, a foot switch input, and 2 separate mono audio inputs for sampling. One is for guitar/mic level, the other is for line level inputs. It's interesting that they gave you 2 jacks here. They could have given you just 1 jack and maybe a switch to change the impedance. But at least this way you can keep 2 other devices permanently attached to this unit. There is a thumb drive replacement for the floppy. This was Akai's first serious sampler. You may be familiar with the S612, which I believe was their first sampler, but was created on the bleeding edge of technology and didn't have very good specs. The S900, on the other hand, includes good specs for the time. 750 kilobytes of RAM with sample frequencies from 7.5 to 40 kilohertz. It's not a very deep device, but it was perfectly acceptable at the time. The manual has less than 30 pages. Good condition units sell for as low as $600, but like a lot of this older tech, you'll find some people selling them for way over $1,000. And I try to keep everything on this list under $1,000. You're certainly paying a premium for this older tech, and the S900 was prolific. Number 5, Roland S550. I actually own 2 of these from circa late 1988 through the early 2000s when I finally moved to Contact. The S550 is a 12-bit sampler that can sample in mono at 15 or 30 kilohertz. Like other samplers that have multiple outputs and appear on this list, you can sample a stereo sample 1 channel at a time and then route the samples to 2 individual outs, giving you stereo playback. It uses 3.5-inch floppies for sample storage, but a thumb drive replacement is available. On the back panel, you get a mono audio mix output, 8 individual outputs, MIDI in, out, and through on standard 5-pin DIN connectors, a sampling record start-stop 1/4-inch input, and the beloved 2-pin Roland detachable power socket. You also get a monochrome video output and an RGB video output. This is probably one of the coolest features on some Roland samplers. You can connect a video monitor to the sampler and use a mouse to operate the sampler, and it's a lot faster than using the buttons. The downside is that the mouse is proprietary and hard to find. I know that someone made an adapter that you can connect to the front panel mouse port so you can use a standard PC computer mouse, but I don't know if those are still available. There is an optional SCSI board that you can install in the S550 that allows you to connect an external hard drive. I purchased one of these boards years ago when I owned my S550s, and I believe it was pretty expensive, and so was the 80 megabyte hard drive I purchased to use with it. At least it was easy to install. Later, after the spinning hard drive died, I used a zip drive, and that was a lot better. Roland made sequencing software called Director-S that runs on the S550. This is pattern-based and very good for the time. I used it for a while before adopting Cubase in 1998. There was a tablet accessory that you could purchase for the S550 that allowed you to draw waves and do some editing. It was pretty cool. A mono 1/4-inch sampling input is on the front panel along with a 1/4-inch headphone jack. A unit in good condition sells in the range of $300 to $450. Number 4, Yamaha A5000. This sampler is Yamaha's pinnacle of sampler technology and was released circa 2000. This time period of 1999 and 2000 was the last hurrah for major hardware sampler releases from big manufacturers. Specs are only fair compared to other units available at this time. 16-bit sampling at 44.1, 22.05, 11.025, 5.5125 kilohertz in mono or stereo. 4, 8, 16, or 32 megs of RAM. On the back panel, you get a stereo output plus another pair of assignable outputs. That's weak for this time period. Even devices in the mid-80s had as many as 8 individual outputs as standard. MIDI in, out, and through on standard 5-pin DIN connectors, plus a second set of MIDI connectors that include an in and a through. There is a SCSI connector and a standard IEC power connector. On the front panel, you get all the controls, though not as many as other devices from this era. The display is graphic and large, but not as large as some others. There are 9 buttons, 10 if you count the power switch, 11 if you count the eject button for the floppy drive, which takes 3.5-inch floppies. There are 7 knobs, 8 if you count the contrast control. It's pretty underwhelming compared to the Akai and EMU samplers available at this time, although I will say that 5 of the knobs are set up with the display as soft knobs, so that's helpful. It's a 2 rack space unit, whereas the Akais and the EMU devices from this time period allow for much more front panel controls because they are bigger devices. And that also includes bigger displays. Also on the front panel are separate left and right audio sampling inputs and a stereo 1/4-inch headphone jack. The back panel does include 1 expansion slot for an audio card that provides 6 more analog audio outputs, 8 channels of ADAT in and out, and a SPDIF in and out. I'm not sure if those are actually ADAT and SPDIF connectors. I believe they are based on their appearance, and I couldn't find very much in the manual. So do your own due diligence on that if you're interested in this unit. A good condition A5000 runs in the range of $450. When I looked, there weren't many for sale. I'm guessing they didn't sell too well, which sounds right when you compare them spec-wise to the Akais and the EMUs from this time period. It's underwhelming for the era, but reasonable at the used price point. Number 3, Roland S760. This unit was released circa 1993. It's a 16-bit, 24-voice stereo sampler with digital filters, all in a 1 rack mount space package. Sampling frequencies include 16, 22.05, 24, 32, 44.1, and 48 kilohertz. It originally sold with only 2 megabytes of RAM, upgradable to 32 megabytes of RAM. It has a graphic display, but it's only 160 by 64 dots. That's pretty small, but it was perfectly acceptable for that time period. Also on the front panel are 16 buttons, 3 knobs, a 1/4-inch stereo headphone jack, and a 3.5-inch floppy drive. On the rear panel, you'll find 6 1/4-inch audio outputs, a MIDI in jack, a combo out/through jack, and a SCSI port. In 1994, Roland released the OP760 expansion card that adds digital inputs and outputs, video outputs, and a mouse input. Just like the Roland S550 before it, with the expansion card, you can use the S760 with a color monitor and a mouse. Hans Zimmer used a rack of Roland 760s to mock up orchestral score. He was kind of a pioneer of that. Used bass units or ones with expanded memory sell in the $250 to $400 range. Maxed out units with the optical card and 32 megabytes of RAM sell in the $600 to $800 range. Something to make note of is that the displays are subject to failing. Dots can look faded or an entire line of dots can be absent, making the screen hard to read. Obviously, if you're using it with an external monitor, not much of a problem. Number 2, EMU Systems E6400 Ultra. I wanted to include at least one EMU system sampler if possible. I was trying to keep all these samplers under $1,000, and I've done that. Obviously, it was never going to be an emulator. The emulator one sells for around $2,500, and the 3 is closer to $4,500. Those are classic units, and you pay a premium for them, even though the specs aren't as good as the unit I'm going to discuss. Also, the E4XT is a great unit by EMU, but it costs around $1,500. The E6400 Ultra is a great unit from 1999. You get 64 voices, upgradable to 128, and a nice big display. 16 megabytes of RAM standard, expandable to 128 megabytes. There's no installed hard drive, but there are options to install either a SCSI or an IDE hard drive. And on a lot of these units, it's already been done for you because the units are used and people have already put them in. It's possible to add sound ROM cards that give you sounds from the Proteus line, and there would be no load times for these sounds. Remember, the Korg Triton was out around about this time, and it had both Rompler sounds and sampler capabilities, so EMU was probably trying to compete with those specifications, and others. On the back panel, you get 8 audio outputs, MIDI in, out, and through on standard 5-pin DIN connectors, and a SCSI port. There is an option to add 8 more audio outputs, and there are a pair of audio inputs for sampling. There are also punch-outs on the back panel for installing interface option cards, like another set of MIDI connectors, and digital I/O like ADAT. You can connect a standard PC keyboard to a jack on the rear panel. This series of samplers includes the top-of-the-line E4XT Ultra, eSynth Ultra, E6400 Ultra, which is the one we're talking about, and E5000. The first 3 can essentially have the same functionality through upgrades. I'll throw up a little list on the screen so you can see what I mean. It's possible to find an upgraded E6400 Ultra with equal or better functionality than an E4XT for less money. All these units use the same operating system and are also very capable synthesizers. I've seen E6400 Ultras with upgraded specs that include 128 voices in the $600 to $800 price range, and unexpanded units for less than $500. Be aware you should buy a unit with the specs you need. Finding expansion cards to add hard drives and other functionality is probably not possible anymore. Those cards would have run out of stock years ago. Perhaps you'll get lucky, perhaps not. I wouldn't risk it. The good news is that even a base unit with a SCSI port on the rear and only 64 voices is still a great unit. At number 1, Akai S6000, S5000 from 1999. These 2 samplers get the number 1 spot for being 2 of the big daddies of affordable samplers. These are almost identical units, which is why I included them together, except for the display, which is detachable on the 6000, but not detachable on the 5000, and there's 1 or 2 other minor details. The 6000 came mostly fully loaded. The 5000 was a stripped-down version that you could expand as your wallet allowed. This was actually a cool move by Akai. The specifications for the S6000 are PS2 keyboard input, 128 voices. The S5000 starts with 64 and is expandable to 128. 8 megabytes of RAM, expandable to 256 via SIMs, and of course SIMs are a lot less expensive now than they were back then. 16 individual outputs. The S5000 starts with 8 and is expandable to 16. There is also an optional 16-channel ADAT board, which is optional for both units. Both units sample at either 44.1 kHz or 48 kHz, digital I/O on SPDIF and AES EBU, 2 groups of MIDI ports with in, out, and through on standard 5-pin DIN connectors, which makes the unit 32-part multi-timbral. Pretty impressive. 2 SCSI ports with a termination switch, word clock input, 2 LFOs with 9 waveforms, 26 types of resonant filters. 26 types, that's a lot. A 1 gigabyte jazz drive was available as an option for the S6000. Onboard effects and a partridge in a pear tree. I know that some people have done some really crazy mods to these with flash RAM and some other things. The Akais and the Emus, number 1 and number 2 on this list, they're really the titans from this period. Those are just monster hardware samplers. Contact came out in 2002, and that all but killed dedicated samplers, certainly at that level. You can pick up a good condition S6000 in the $750 to $900 range, and a good condition S5000 in the $450 to $750 range. Obviously, a low price S5000 probably hasn't been expanded very much, or at all, but it's still a great unit. The 6000s are probably and are usually the best value. There are a lot of samplers that are worthy that didn't make this list. I created a massive list of samplers. There will be at least one more list, depending on how well this episode does with views. I'd also like to do a high-end list. I think that would be really fun. Hopefully I haven't wasted your time. Take care, and I'll be back in another episode soon.